Just Chapter 1. Edward, Zippy, and the Giant Frog. In the year 40,051, the world was still alive, but it was not the world humankind had once known. The cities still stood in pieces, their towers leaning like old trees in a tired forest. Glass bridges hung broken between buildings wrapped in ivy. Roads had cracked and split so deeply that rivers now ran through them. Trains slept under hills of moss. Great metal ships rested in deserts where oceans had once been. And in the old oceans, coral and bright fish drifted through the bones of forgotten human machines. Humans were nearly gone. Some said a few still wandered in hidden places, deep underground or far beyond the northern ice. But if that was true, no one had seen them in centuries. The world belonged to the animals now, or rather it belonged to life itself, growing wild and strange and clever in the long silence after humankind had faded. And the strangest thing of all was this: the animals had learned to speak. Not all at once, and not by magic anyone could explain. Over many ages, in the echo of human voices left behind in recordings, satellites, shattered schools, and weather-worn storybooks, animals had listened. Ravens repeated words first. Elephants remembered them. Dolphins sang them. Wolves used them only when they had to. Monkeys argued over grammar. Parrots became unbearable. But little by little, English spread everywhere until it became the common language of claw and hoof and feather and fin. So if you walked through the fern-grown streets of the old world in the year 40,051, you might hear a badger discussing architecture with a seal, or a heron giving directions to a bison, or a fox reading aloud from a moldy cookbook to a gathering of raccoons. And in one hidden valley, beneath the rusted remains of an ancient observation tower, there lived an elephant no larger than a chicken. His name was Edward. Now, Edward did not think of himself as tiny all the time, only most of the time. He lived in a snug little home inside the cracked base of a statue whose top half had fallen off ages ago. Nobody knew what the statue had once been. Some thought it had been a human hero. Some thought it had been a machine. A family of lizards insisted it had obviously been a giant salt shaker, though no one took them seriously. Edward had decorated his home with bottle-cap saucers, a walnut shell bed, and strips of faded cloth he had collected from the ruins nearby. He kept shiny things on a shelf made from a bent spoon, a green marble, a silver button, the lens from a pair of old glasses, and a tiny brass badge stamped with a star. He was a neat elephant, a thoughtful elephant, a very small elephant. And he had a dream so large it barely fit inside him. Edward wanted to be a woolly mammoth. Not simply a mammoth in the ordinary sense, if there was an ordinary sense anymore. He wanted to be huge and shaggy and magnificent, with great curved tusks and feet like thunder, and a voice that could roll through valleys like a storm. He wanted snow on his back, and wind in his fur, and legends told about him by campfires. He wanted to loom. Instead, his ears were about the size of leaves, his trunk was short and often dusty, and his steps made hardly any sound at all unless he was crossing dry paper. This troubled him deeply. Each morning, Edward would climb onto a round stone outside his home and practice his mammoth expression. He would squint nobly at the horizon. He would raise his tiny trunk. "I am Edward Mammothson," he would say in the deepest voice he could manage, which was not very deep. "Wanderer of the frozen plains, tremble before my ancient might." Then a breeze would blow him sideways off the stone, and he would have to start over. On the morning our story begins, Edward stood on the stone as usual while dawn spread gold over the valley. Ferns glistened with dew. Birds swooped between the rib-like beams of the fallen tower. In the distance, a herd of deer argued about whether clouds counted as weather. Edward lifted his trunk. "I," he announced, "am a woolly mammoth of destiny." A grasshopper landed on his head. Edward crossed his eyes to look up at it. The grasshopper rubbed its legs together. "You are standing in my breakfast." Edward sighed. "Sorry." The grasshopper hopped away. Edward stepped down from the stone, his ears drooping. He knew very well that no one looked at him and thought, There goes a mighty beast of the Ice Age. Most creatures looked at him and thought one of three things. 1. What a curious mouse. 2. Is that a toy? 3. Oh, a very polite potato with a trunk. The worst part was that Edward had never even seen a woolly mammoth. There weren't any anymore, not for tens of thousands of years. But he had found pictures in old books and half-working screens in the ruins. Mammoths had seemed to him like the answer to a question he had always carried in his heart. They were elephants, but more. Bigger, braver-looking, wrapped in the mystery of winter and time. He wanted to be more. That morning, after nibbling breakfast from a dish of mashed berries and seeds, Edward made a decision. I cannot become a woolly mammoth by sitting in a broken statue base. A nearby snail, halfway up a rock and not involved at all, turned to look at him. I need adventure, Edward continued. Adventure builds character. Character builds greatness. Greatness may possibly build shaggy fur. The snail blinked slowly. Edward took this as encouragement. By noon he had packed for travel. He tied a tiny bundle from a square of blue cloth and filled it with practical supplies. 3 dried peas, a crumb of sweet biscuit, 1 useful string, a thimble for collecting water, and a folded page torn from an ancient nature book showing a picture of a mammoth standing in snow. Edward looked at the picture for a long while before sliding it carefully into the bundle. Then he stood outside his home and looked at the valley he had always known. The old tower cast a crooked shadow over the grass. Dragonflies skimmed over puddles among cracked stones. A warm wind moved through weeds growing from what had once been a staircase. Everything was familiar. Everything was safe. Edward's stomach fluttered. What if I don't find adventure? He whispered. Then he thought of another question, one that sat heavier in his chest. What if I don't find any friends? That, more than anything, was why he had decided to leave. Edward had neighbors, of course. He knew a pair of argumentative voles, a sleepy tortoise who collected slogans from old billboards, and a crow named Denise, who claimed to be writing a masterpiece, but had so far only written the title 17 times. They were all fine company in small doses. But Edward wanted true friends, friends who would walk beside him, friends who would laugh with him, and perhaps not laugh at him. Friends who might believe that even a chicken-sized elephant could be someone important. So he squared his tiny shoulders and set off down the old road. The road had once been black and smooth, but now it was a crumbling path split by roots and lined with chest-high grasses that rose over Edward like a forest. Here and there, white lines still showed through the cracks, faded but stubborn. Edward marched along one of these lines as if it were a royal highway built especially for him. At first he felt bold. He saluted a passing butterfly. He nodded gravely to a toadstool. He practiced larger footsteps, trying to make a satisfying mammoth-like thud. They came out more like tap, tap, tap. By afternoon, the valley gave way to the outskirts of a ruined town. Buildings leaned together like tired giants whispering secrets. Vines hung from shattered windows. A bus lay on its side in a field of yellow flowers, and a family of hares had made a warren beneath the driver's seat. Edward entered cautiously. The shadows were cooler here. Pigeons fluttered under awnings. Somewhere overhead, monkeys were discussing treasure maps in dreadful accents. Edward kept close to the wall of an old bakery with its sign half fallen away. That was when he heard the voice. Hey, hey, Stripes, Stripes, move. Edward looked around. There came a rattling clatter from up ahead, followed by a squeak, a yelp, and the sound of many small objects bouncing down metal. Edward hurried forward as quickly as his little legs would allow. In the middle of what had once been a market square stood a vending machine tilted against a lamppost. Its front glass had long ago shattered, but its metal spirals and shelves remained. At the very top, somehow, was a tiny zebra no bigger than a chihuahua. The zebra's hind leg was stuck between 2 bent spirals. Around him lay a rain of old bottle caps, acorns, screws, and 1 deeply embarrassed orange. Edward gasped. Oh dear. The zebra twisted to look at him. Are you here to help, or are you collecting reactions? I'm here to help, said Edward. Excellent, because I'd prefer not to live up here forever. It's drafty, and I've insulted at least 3 pigeons already. Edward trotted to the base of the machine and looked up. The zebra had bright eyes, quick as sparks, and a mane that stood in charming disarray. His black and white stripes were slightly dusty, and he wore around his neck a loop of red thread with a rusty key tied to it. "How did you get up there?" Edward asked. "I climbed," said the zebra, "very successfully, until the part where I stopped succeeding." Edward examined the bent spiral. "If you hold still, maybe I can pull your leg free." "I can try holding still," said the zebra. "No promises. Stillness isn't one of my leading talents." Edward climbed onto a fallen crate, then onto a jutting metal flap, then up into the machine itself. To him it felt like scaling a mountain made of stale snacks and rust. At last, he reached the zebra's trapped leg. "Ready?" Edward asked. "Never," said the zebra. "Go on." Edward braced himself and pulled with all his might. The spiral creaked. The zebra bit his lip. Edward pulled harder, every muscle trembling. For one glorious second, he imagined himself as a mighty mammoth hauling a glacier. Then the metal gave way all at once. The zebra dropped. Edward dropped. The bent spiral came with them. They landed in a heap among bottle caps and old leaves. For a moment neither spoke. Then the zebra sat up and said, "Well, that was less graceful than I'd hoped, but considerably more successful." Edward scrambled upright. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you?" "No." The zebra stood, shook himself all over, and gave Edward a bright grin. "You rescued me. That means I'm morally obligated to think well of you." Edward smiled shyly. "I'm Edward." "I'm Zippy," said the zebra, bowing with dramatic flourish. "Explorer, collector, escape artist of uneven quality, and part-time judge of abandoned places." Edward had never met anyone who introduced himself that way. He liked Zippy immediately. "What were you doing in a vending machine?" he asked. Zippy glanced at the scattered objects on the ground and looked slightly sheepish. "Treasure hunting," he said. Edward looked at the orange. Zippy sighed. "Yes, all right, my standards are broad. But in my defense, I had reason to believe there might be something remarkable inside." "And was there?" Zippy tapped the rusty key hanging around his neck. "Found this." Edward's eyes widened. "A key? What does it open?" "If I knew that," said Zippy, "I'd already be there." That seemed fair. They spent the next few minutes gathering Zippy's spilled treasures into a little pouch made of woven grass. Most were useless. One was a smooth blue stone with a hole in it, which Zippy was delighted to recover. Another was a shiny coin stamped with a human face so worn it looked like a potato. The orange, after a brief discussion, was left behind. At last, Zippy sat back on his haunches and studied Edward. "You're very small for an elephant," he said. Edward's ears dipped. "Yes." "You know," Zippy continued, "I'm very small for a zebra." Edward blinked. "You are?" "Certainly. Most zebras are bigger than me. Door handles, laundry baskets, one particularly rude goose. Yet here I stand, magnificent despite scale." Edward couldn't help laughing. Zippy leaned closer. "And what brings a tiny elephant to a dead market square? Dramatic backstory, noble mission, need for snacks?" Edward hesitated, then told the truth. "I've gone looking for adventure," he said. "And friends." Zippy's expression softened. "Ah," he said. "Those are good things to look for. Hard things sometimes, but good." Edward looked down at his feet. "Also, I want to become a woolly mammoth." There was a brief silence. A pigeon overhead muttered, "I respect it." Zippy did not laugh. Instead, he sat thoughtfully, tail flicking. "That's ambitious." "I know," Edward said quickly. "Probably impossible, really. I'm not even large for a regular elephant. And there isn't any snow here, and I don't have fur, and—" "But you want to feel grand," Zippy said. Edward stopped. "Yes," he said quietly. Zippy nodded as if Edward had said something important, because he had. "Well," said Zippy, "I can't promise mammothhood, but adventure I can definitely help with. I was on one already, you know, or trying to be. The key is part of it." Edward looked at the rusty key again. "What adventure?" Zippy glanced around the ruined square, then lowered his voice, though there was no one nearby except a beetle rolling half a cherry. "I've heard of a place beyond the town," Zippy said. "An old station, half sunk into the ground where the earth split open years ago. Some call it Echo Station, Some call it the humming burrow. A magpie told a ferret who told a boar who told me that there's a locked chamber there, full of human relics and maps. Maps to what? Zippy's eyes shone. Which are obviously the best kind. Edward's heart beat faster. You want to find the chamber? I do. Using that key? It fits in the story beautifully, doesn't it? Edward considered this. He had left home that morning hoping for adventure and friendship. By afternoon, both seemed to have stumbled out of a vending machine. If you like, Zippy said, suddenly casual in the way of someone pretending not to mind either answer, you could come along. Edward straightened. Really? Certainly. You seem brave. Also helpful. Also you have a trunk, which strikes me as generally useful. Edward beamed. I'd like that very much. Splendid, said Zippy. Then we're a traveling company of two. He held out one tiny hoof. Edward touched it with the tip of his trunk. And just like that, beneath a broken lamppost in a dead human square, a friendship began. They left the town before evening, following a cracked boulevard lined with wild roses. Zippy trotted ahead and behind and to either side in a restless zigzag, as if one direction alone was too limiting. Edward walked more steadily, though his gaze wandered everywhere. Together they made an unusual pair, a chicken-sized elephant and a chihuahua-sized zebra moving through the bones of the old world, under a sky vast enough for all lost things. As they went, they talked. Zippy had been born near the great rail gardens, where old train tracks stretched for miles under canopies of vines and fig trees. Herd animals, he explained, had once lived there in large stripy communities, but Zippy had always preferred wandering. Too many opinions in a herd, he said. Too much discussion about grass quality and posture. Every stranger knows something I don't. Edward thought this was an excellent reason. And you, Zippy asked, where are you from? Edward told him about the valley, the broken statue, the shelf of treasures, and his morning mammoth speeches. Zippy stumbled laughing at that, though not unkindly. Oh, Edward, he said, I'm glad I met you. Edward found that he was glad too. Near sunset they reached the edge of a wide plain where the city ruins gave way to open land. Long ago it might have been a park or farmland. Now it rolled away in tall grass and ponds silvered by the lowering sun. Far off, black skeletons of wind turbines turned slowly in the orange light. This way, said Zippy. Echo Station lies beyond the plain, near a ridge of old concrete pipes. How far? Zippy squinted. Not impossible far. Maybe one sleep away, if nothing dramatic happens. Naturally, something dramatic happened almost at once. They had only just begun crossing the plain when a shadow swept over them. Edward ducked. Zippy flattened himself. A hawk circled overhead. For a terrible moment, Edward understood exactly how small he was. Out in the open, with no tree roots or stones close by, he and Zippy must have looked like very manageable snacks. Don't run in different directions, Zippy whispered. Predators love decisiveness. What do we do? Edward whispered back. The hawk wheeled lower, sharp eyes fixed on them. Edward's mind raced. He was not a mammoth. He was hardly even a proper obstacle. But he had to think of something. Then he saw, half hidden in the grass, the rusted shell of an old metal cooking pot. Follow me, he squeaked. He bolted toward it, Zippy racing beside him. The hawk stooped, wings folding, slicing through the air. Edward reached the pot first and dove inside through a jagged opening. Zippy leaped in after him just as the hawk's claws struck metal with a shriek. The whole pot rang like a bell. Inside, Edward and Zippy tumbled against each other in darkness, while the hawk beat its wings above, scraping and pecking. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Edward's heart hammered so hard he thought it might shake the pot apart. This is unpleasant, Zippy shouted over the noise. I know. The hawk pecked again. Edward looked around wildly. The pot had another opening on the far side, smaller, partly blocked by dirt. We can crawl out there, he said. And then? Edward swallowed. Then we keep thinking. They scrambled through the dirt and roots, pushing at the narrow gap until it gave way. They burst out the back of the pot into deeper grass. The hawk was still on top, distracted for the moment. Zippy panted. Where now? Edward's gaze fell on a patch of purple flowers nearby, thick with buzzing insects. This, Chapter 2. Marv of the humming marsh. Morning arrived softly over the plain. The hawk was gone. Dew hung on every blade of grass, turning the world silver and green. Edward woke curled beneath a broad leaf, and for one sleepy moment, he forgot where he was. Then he saw the rusted cooking pot nearby, half buried in the earth like a dented moon, and remembered the hawk, the running, the hiding, and Zippy. Zippy was already awake. In fact, he was balancing on a stone, facing the sunrise as though making an announcement to the day itself. "Good morning, world," Zippy declared. "Please be less bitey than yesterday." Edward smiled and stood. "Do you think it heard you?" "I should hope so," said Zippy. I used my formal tone. They shared the last of Edward's dried peas and drank dew from curled leaves. Then the two friends set off once more across the plain, heading toward the place Zippy had called Echo Station. The land changed as they walked. The grass grew taller and wetter. The ground softened underfoot. Dragonflies zipped through the air like little glass machines. Here and there old chunks of human road rose out of the earth, cracked and sinking, only to vanish again under moss and reeds. By midday, they could hear water. Not the rush of a river, but the broad, sleepy sounds of a marsh. Gentle splashes, rustling reeds, croaking from far and near. The plain had become a wetland stretching toward the horizon, broken by islands of mud, patches of lilies, and strange metal ruins sticking out of the water at odd angles. Ahead, half swallowed by reeds, stood what remained of Echo Station. At least, Edward thought it must be Echo Station. A long, low building of concrete and rusted steel leaned beside a flooded trench. Vines draped across old signs. A broken platform jutted over dark water, and beneath it something hummed faintly in the earth, a deep mechanical murmur that rose and fell like a giant snoring in its sleep. Zippy's eyes went wide. "Oh," he breathed, "that is extremely promising." Edward stared too. "It's beautiful." And it was, in the strange way of forgotten things. The station looked lonely, but not dead. Life had moved in. Reeds whispered around its walls. Swallows nested in the rafters. A turtle sunned itself on what might once have been a luggage cart. The whole place seemed caught between the old world and the new. They picked their way along a narrow strip of cracked pavement toward the station entrance. Twice, Edward nearly slipped in the mud, and once Zippy had to yank him back by his little travel cloth. "Thank you," Edward said breathlessly. "Of course," said Zippy. "If you fall in, I have no idea whether elephants float. I don't know either. Let's call that valuable research for another day." As they came closer, the humming grew louder. Zippy touched the rusty key around his neck. "If there really is a locked chamber here, I bet it's underground." Edward looked at the flooded trench. "I hope it's not too underground." They reached the platform and stopped. A wide doorway yawned open into the dim station interior. Inside were broken benches, old signs in peeling paint, and a floor covered with reeds that had blown in over the years. At the far end of the room, a staircase descended into shadow. "Underground," said Zippy quietly. Edward nodded. They went in together. Their footsteps echoed softly. Dust motes drifted in shafts of light from the broken roof. On one wall hung a faded map, protected behind cracked glass. Most of the labels had worn away, but colored lines still crossed the page like tangled vines. Zippy looked at it in delight. "A map already. This place is showing excellent manners." Edward smiled, though he kept glancing at the staircase. At the top of the stairs stood a metal gate. It had once slid open and shut, but now it was half buried in mud and stuck crooked in its track. Beyond it, darkness. Zippy stepped forward. This could be it. He took the key from around his neck and held it up. There, just beside the gate, half hidden by rust and moss, was a keyhole. Edward's trunk lifted in excitement. "It fits." "Well," said Zippy, trying to sound calm and failing gloriously, "there's only one way to find out." He climbed onto a bent bar of the gate, stretched his neck, and pushed the key into the lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then came a heavy clunk from deep inside the mechanism. The gate shuddered, and from somewhere below the station came a tremendous voice. "Who is fiddling with my door?" The floor trembled. Edward squeaked. Zippy yelped and fell backward into a pile of reeds. Then something huge moved in the dark beneath the stairs. Slowly, very slowly, a giant green head rose from the flooded lower level beyond the gate. Two enormous golden eyes blinked. Water streamed off a broad face. A throat the size of a wagon swelled and relaxed. Edward stared. Zippy stared. The creature kept rising until they could see all of him through the bars. A colossal frog, green and mossy, with spots like lily shadows and legs thicker than old tree trunks. If he stood to his fullest height, Edward guessed, the frog would reach about 1.5 stories tall. Then, to Edward's complete astonishment, the giant frog said in a less booming and rather embarrassed voice, "Oh, you're little." There was a long silence. Finally, Edward managed, "Yes." Zippy stood up, dusting reeds from his side. "And you're not." The frog gave a slow blink. "Fair." He shifted closer to the gate and peered down at them. His expression, despite his size, was not frightening so much as tired and hopeful. "Sorry about shouting," he said. "I don't get visitors often, and the lock usually means trouble. Are you here to steal my turnips?" Edward and Zippy exchanged a glance. "No," said Edward. "Excellent," said the frog. "Then perhaps we can begin again. Hello, I'm Marv." Edward stepped forward. "I'm Edward." "And I'm Zippy," said Zippy, recovering quickly. "Explorer, collector, survivor of vending machines, and currently confused." Marv nodded politely. "Nice to meet you both." Zippy pointed at the gate. "Do you live down there?" "I do," said Marv. "Quite comfortably, actually. There's water, shade, some old electrical humming that helps me sleep, and a very serviceable patch for turnips. Also, no one bothers me except dragonflies, and they don't count because they bother everyone." Edward drew a little closer. "Were you the locked chamber?" Marv looked offended. "I should hope not. I'm a frog." Zippy coughed into one hoof to hide a laugh. Marv's expression softened. "There is a chamber down below, though. Or was. It's flooded now. Most of the human things in it are soggy and not very impressive, unless you're fond of damp manuals." Zippy's ears drooped just slightly. "Oh." Marv noticed. "But there are some maps I rescued. Up on a shelf. Dry enough, I think." Zippy brightened at once. "I use them as conversation pieces when I'm pretending I have guests." Edward's heart gave a small tug at that. Marv was huge, so huge that he made the station seem built for him. But something about his voice sounded lonely in a way Edward understood immediately. "Could we see them?" Edward asked. Marv hesitated. "Well, the gate sticks. I can't reach the upper latch from inside very well. And I'm not graceful with small mechanisms. If you opened it, you could come down, if you wanted." "We want," said Zippy at once. Together, he and Edward worked at the gate. Zippy pulled at a release lever crusted with rust, while Edward pushed with all his tiny strength against the lower bars. At first, nothing moved. Then Marv pressed gently from the other side with one huge webbed hand. The gate shrieked and slid open just enough for Edward and Zippy to slip through. Below the stairs, the lower station had become a watery cavern. Old tiled walls gleamed under moss. Pools covered the floor. Roots curled through the ceiling. In the middle sat Marv like a green hill come alive. Up close he was even bigger, but his eyes were kind. He dipped his head. "Mind the puddle on the left. It's deeper than it looks, and contains Bernard." "Who's Bernard?" Edward asked. "A catfish with no boundaries," said Marv. A whiskered face surfaced briefly nearby, looked at them, and sank again. Marv led them to a dry ledge made from the top of an old ticket booth. There, tucked safely under a sheet of bent metal, lay several rolled maps, a metal lunchbox, and a collection of polished stones. "I kept the dry things dry," Marv said. Zippy climbed onto the ledge in delight. "Marv, this is a proper treasure hoard." "You think so?" "Absolutely." While Zippy carefully unrolled the maps, Edward sat beside Marv and looked around the chamber. It was cozy in a grand, watery way. Ferns grew from cracks in the walls. A warm shaft of sunlight came through the broken roof above, painting the water gold. "Do you live here alone?" Edward asked. Marv gave a slow nod. "Mostly. Creatures pass through. Herons, eels, a family of theatrical ducks one summer. But nobody stays. I'm rather large, you see." Edward looked at his own tiny feet. I'm rather small. Marv turned one enormous eye toward him. That can be lonely too. Edward smiled a little. Yes. On the ledge, Zippy gasped. What is it? Edward asked. Zippy held up one of the maps. This one shows the old routes through the western ruins. And this one, look, elevated gardens, reservoirs, underground passages. Marv, these are marvelous. Marv's throat puffed with shy pride. Thank you, I've read them many times, though I can't go most places. I'm not built for narrow adventures. Zippy looked from the maps to Marv. Then he looked at Edward. An idea clearly arrived all at once. Edward, he said, what if Echo Station wasn't the end of the adventure? Edward blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Zippy said, we were looking for something wonderful, and we found maps, yes, but also Marv. And there are whole places still out there, reservoirs and gardens and ruins and who knows what else. We could keep going, all of us. Marv made a tiny croak of surprise. All of us? Why not, said Zippy. You know this, Marsh. You're excellent with storage. Your voice alone could scare off half the sky. And every great traveling company should include a giant frog. Marv stared. He stepped closer to Marv's broad hand and touched it with his trunk. I'd like that, Edward said, if you would. For a moment, Marv said nothing. His great golden eyes blinked once, twice. Then his whole face changed. It softened into such a wide, astonished happiness that Edward thought he had never seen anyone look more truly glad. You mean, Marv said carefully, you'd want me as a friend? Zippy snorted. Marv, you kept dry maps in a flooded station and own a catfish named Bernard. Obviously, yes. A deep sound began in Marv's throat. Edward flinched, thinking he might be about to bellow. But Marv was laughing. It rolled through the chamber like distant thunder, warm and joyful. The water trembled. Bernard surfaced and seemed mildly offended by the noise. Marv wiped one eye with the back of a huge hand. Then yes, he said. Yes, I would like that very much. So there, in the humming marsh beneath an ancient station, the three of them became friends. Edward, the chicken-sized elephant who wanted to be a mammoth, Zippy, the chihuahua-sized zebra who chased mysteries, and Marv, the house-sized frog who had been lonely until that morning. The rest of the day passed happily. Marv shared turnips, which were surprisingly good when sliced thin and dipped in marsh salt. Zippy spread the maps and plotted possible routes with enormous seriousness. Edward explored the ticket booth and found an old human badge shaped like a star, which Marv insisted he keep for official adventurer purposes. By evening, they climbed up onto the broken platform above the marsh to watch sunset together. The sky turned pink, then orange, then a purple so deep it seemed to hum along with the station. Fireflies blinked over the reeds. Far away, something sang from the water. Zippy lay on his side, exhausted and content. Marv rested with his huge front legs folded beneath him, looking out over the shining marsh as if seeing it new. Edward stood between them, the little star badge tucked into his bundle. He thought about the valley he had left, and the lonely road, and the moment he had confessed his impossible dream. He still was not woolly. He was not gigantic. He did not have thunderous feet or tusks that curved like moons. But as the evening wind moved through the reeds, Edward felt something big inside him anyway. Perhaps being a mammoth, he thought, was not only about size. Perhaps it was about courage. Perhaps it was about going out into the world even when you felt small. Perhaps it was about making room in your heart for wonder and friends. He lifted his truck to the glowing sky. I think, he said, this has been a very important chapter. Zippy laughed. That's a wonderfully dramatic thing to say. Marv nodded solemnly. I agree with Edward. This chapter had excellent developments. Edward giggled. Then the three friends sat close together in the warm dusk while stars appeared one by one overhead. Tomorrow they would begin a new journey, following old maps into a world still full of secrets. There would be ruins and gardens and storms and songs and all kinds of things not yet known. But for now, on that quiet platform above the marsh, with the last light shining on water and reed and stone, everything felt bright and possible. Edward was no longer alone. Zippy was no longer wandering by himself. Marv was no longer waiting in the humming dark for guests who never came. They had found one another. And for a world so old, that was a wonderfully new beginning.